check it out. I thought places like this only existed in movies.
Yeah, well, either way, I don't like it.
You kidding me? This is my kind of place. Full of the type of people I like. Quiet and out of the way.
When I think back on the PlayStation 2 era, there's a number of vastly different titles that you could refer to as underrated or forgotten gems, since the majority of the PS2's catalogue is now essentially abandonware. I still own a PS2 and a small collection of games that I grew up with, but I have a fair bit of reticence about booting up that old console, which means I haven't been able to enjoy a lot of my old favourite games. But that changed recently when I downloaded the latest version of the PC SX2 emulator to capture some footage from the PS2 port of Jak and Daxter: The Lost Frontier, and I realised that whoever worked on the DuckStation PS1 emulator had updated this particular emulator, which I had never had much joy with trying to use in the past. This meant that I could finally replay one of my favourite PS2 games in HD without any drastic frame rate issues or missing graphical features. Like you can see in G-Man Live's review, the emulator back then wouldn't render any of the skyboxes, which ruined the presentation.
I'm devastated.
That game is the 2006 first-person shooter Black, developed by Criterion Games, who were famous for the Burnout series at the time, and later worked on Need for Speed before being sent into the EA mines making content for Battlefield and Star Wars Battlefront. Black was something of an ambitious title, and one of the last technical showcases for the PS2, alongside Resident Evil 4 and Final Fantasy XII. So let's load up and see why Black is still worth revisiting all these years later, shall we? There isn't too much info out there regarding the development of Black, but the developers did say that they took influence from the shootout scenes in movies like Hard Boiled and The Matrix. Criterion stated their intention was to do for shooting what Burnout did for racing games, tear it apart, which if you played Burnout 3 or Burnout Revenge, was an exciting prospect, and it does seem like at one point during development, Black was meant to be a bit more arcadey like Burnout. A prototype from August 2005 shows the game having a score system that seemed to reward points for different kinds of kills, like the 2012 spiritual successor Body Count, but this was scrapped by the time that public demos of the game were made available. It's hard to say why this feature was scrapped, as it could have helped add to the game's overall replayability, but I think the developers felt the tone of the game was perhaps clashing with these more arcade-like elements. This is a demo that I replayed countless times back in 2006, before I finally got my hands on a copy of the full game, and it was curious to note while replaying this demo that the enemy count in this level was significantly higher than the full game, making it a lot more challenging. Regardless, what we got was still a pretty impressive shooter, especially running on a console, that, despite a few missteps here and there, was ahead of its time in terms of the sheer chaos and destruction of its action.
I can't remember. RPG hit the building, everything's blank after that.
And your next assignment?
Doubleheader. Destroy a 7th wave weapons cache and stronghold at Nazran.
You were ordered to RV with a Lieutenant McCarver en route to the objective?
Yes. Would have been a breeze if the maps and the intel on the border crossing wasn't out of date. Only thing right about it was the farm.
The story for Black is pretty bare bones, as you take on the role of Sergeant Keller, who is really good at disobeying orders and causing collateral damage, tasked with hunting down a man named Lennox, who is the leader of an organization called 7th Wave. Set across 8 levels, the campaign will see you tearing your way through a number of different locations like war-torn city streets, forests, munition factories, abandoned asylums, and even a shipyard. Most of these missions are pretty linear in design, with your goal essentially just being to keep moving forward and shooting everything in your way. Although on the higher difficulties you are required to complete a certain number of secondary objectives too. These involve things like collecting or destroying pieces of intel, and finding special weapons hidden throughout the maps.
Look at that. You helped me find my smile.
The second mission, the Treneska border crossing, despite being a lot slower than the other missions, is actually one of my favourites, as it offers quite a bit of freedom to explore and wander off the beaten path. That, and there's just something about PS2 era jungles and forests that's always such a vibe to me. On easy and normal difficulty, you can hold up to 3 medkits, which you can use at any time, whereas on hard and Black Ops mode, you can only restore your health from stim packs dropped by falling enemies. There's a decent roster of weapons to play with across the campaign, ranging from Uzis, MP5s, AK-47s, M16s, a MAC-10, along with a few pistols and shotguns, as well as a grenade launcher and an RPG. All of these weapons have been modeled really well, with some impressive looking reload animations, and the sound design does a really good job at making these guns sound powerful. But there is a bit of a sense across the game that all of these guns are a bit interchangeable. Like, there's not much difference between the Remington shotgun and the PS2's, and the only difference I noticed between the AK-47 and the M16 was the magazine size. The game is also from that console shooter era of 2 weapon limits, which forces you to be a bit selective about what kind of loadout to have during missions. Often it's best to have an assault rifle for standard combat, and then either a shotgun or an explosive weapon like an RPG if you can find one.
Maybe they're getting ready for a garage sale.
The enemy designs are nothing really worth writing home about, with your standard grunt soldiers, armor-wearing shotgun guys, and these dudes with shields that start popping up about halfway through the game. Their AI does what it needs them to do, essentially running around taking cover. It's nothing revelatory like Halo, but it gets the job done, and there is some great animation work on display when enemies are killed, like they'll fall over railings and hilariously go flying through the air when taken out by explosions. That looks like a blend of ragdoll physics and preset animations for when they collide into objects or walls. Black also has particularly great sound design with the weapons and all the impacts in the environment, like glass shattering, bullets ricocheting off steel, and tearing through walls. It's not uncommon for explosions to trigger a cascade of sound effects as goons go flying and glass breaks. It's all impressive stuff. The score by Michael Giacchino is also really good when you can actually hear it, as a lot of the missions will rely on the in-game soundscape and atmosphere to build tension, but it really elevates the action when it's used, like in the Asylum level. Where Black really shines is undoubtedly with its presentation, and this is without a doubt one of the best looking shooters running on the PS2, especially if you do comparisons with other console shooters of the time, though the last few Call of Duty games weren't too shabby, I guess. It runs on the RenderWare engine, which Criterion themselves developed, and this is an engine that was used extensively by other developers during this era, including Rockstar Games with the Grand Theft Auto series. Black really pushes this engine to its breaking point, figuratively speaking. One of the things that really stood out while replaying the game at a higher resolution was the fantastic lighting work seen throughout. This was back when developers were forced to bake much of the lighting and rely on little tricks like fake volumetrics seen here in the forest, that gives off the impression of the moonlight being filtered through the trees. It's pretty obvious now how this effect has been achieved, and they use these fake volumetrics and other light sources filtering through windows constantly throughout the game. This was back when developers could take a lot of artistic liberties with lighting, and Black really shines in this regard. The art direction is also superb, with the worlds looking suitably gritty and dilapidated, making Black really stand out amongst other shooters of the era. Even if the actual level design itself isn't particularly complex, the game really does stand apart as a visual powerhouse compared to a lot of other shooters on the PS2. Which brings me to Black's much touted destruction effects. There had been other games in the past with destruction elements. I recall parts of Max Payne 2 having some neat moments like destroying the stairwell, and Red Faction tried to design its gameplay around destruction simulation. But Black really made a valiant effort to be as over the top and explosive as it could, and you can see it in the first level. Entire structures can be brought down like this tower. Throw a grenade into a building and watch as the explosion sends smoke erupting into the air as all the windows shatter, littering the scene in falling glass. You can shoot explosive canisters and watch as the nearby buildings shatter. Your bullets will tear through boxes, destroy flimsy drywalls, and reduce concrete columns made of chunky matrixonite down to the gnarled steel underneath. All of this mayhem sends up multiple particle effects too that can often fill up the screen as explosions go off and your bullets start kicking dust off from the walls. It's truly impressive just how much carnage you're able to cause, especially in levels like the Asylum, which is probably the best showcase for the game's destruction, and when everything about the game really clicks. Of course, it's highly exaggerated, as often buildings that you're forced to fire an RPG at will trigger a cascade of explosions all throughout the structure, but it still looks really cool, again, especially for a PlayStation 2 game. However, for as impressive as a lot of the destruction in Black is, it's also quite limited and more often than not heavily scripted, with most structures having preset animations for how they're destroyed. The geomod destruction physics from Red Faction Guerrilla was still a few years away at this point, but Criterion still made a commendable effort in that there is a lot of bespoke destruction animations, many that seem to be handcrafted for their specific levels. And while in a lot of the interior locations the walls and columns can be fully destroyed, most of the time your only real impact on a surface is to leave a chunky looking sprite on said surface that kicks up a bunch of particles.
I'm devastated.
As I said before, levels like the Asylum are when everything really clicks with Black's gameplay. However, probably about half of the game is set in outdoor locations, where there's obviously a lot less things for you to destroy. Probably the least exciting levels are the Shipyard level and the Graznai Bridge, which just goes on and on and on. That level highlighted a few annoying design choices that hold Black back from being a lot better, like its sparsely placed checkpoints. Most of the levels in the campaign can take you upwards of an hour to beat on your first playthrough, and checkpoints can often see you losing anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes of progress, which is incredibly frustrating. Enemies are also annoyingly inconsistent when it comes to soaking up damage. Sometimes you can drop them fairly quickly, while other times they'll shrug off half a clip like it's nothing. And the game sometimes isn't sure what kind of explosion constitutes as being lethal to a nearby enemy. Like sometimes explosions will go off right in front of them and they won't so much as flinch.
It's not fair!
Some of the combat arenas also feel really cheap too, with the game just constantly spawning in more enemies until you either kill every single one of them, or when you finally destroy a requisite MacGuffin in the room that ends the level. It unfortunately means that you'll wind up playing Black a lot more like a tactical shooter on your first playthrough, rather than going all guns blazing, and it kinda makes the game feel a tad underwhelming, especially with its incredibly short campaign that clocks in at around 6 to 7 hours. And the game doesn't really offer much in terms of anything to unlock after the campaign is finished, as there's also no multiplayer either. Finishing the campaign unlocks silver weapons, which have unlimited ammo, but I always found that the guns just looked really ugly in silver, and there's also so much ammo in the game organically that it feels a bit pointless, unless you're using something like the grenade launcher. Beating the campaign on hard unlocks the Black Ops mode, which isn't actually all that much different from hard. It just adds extra destruction objectives where you have to destroy certain structures throughout a level, so it's not a big game changer. Maybe if the Black Ops mode had incorporated the more arcadey elements from the prototype build, then it could have been a really cool and worthwhile addition to the game to try and unlock. Having said that though, I do believe that Black is a game that gets a lot better with subsequent playthroughs. Once you know the majority of enemy spawn points, as well as where all the destruction elements are placed around the maps, it really becomes an incredibly satisfying experience as you're able to play it more like a fast-paced shooter and use the destruction in some really engaging ways, like I think the developers intended you to.
Well played, Timmy. Well played.
Black wasn't quite a masterpiece due to some of these design shortcomings, but Criterion still made a highly commendable effort, and it truly was a spectacular technical showcase for the aging PS2 hardware. While its destruction simulation was clearly limited by the tech of the time, Black laid down a lot of groundwork that other games would later follow in the next generation that pushed destruction even further. Games like Battlefield Bad Company, Stranglehold, Red Faction Guerrilla, and Black's own spiritual successor, Body Count, which is another game that I'm looking forward to revisiting. And while it's more of a successor to Fear, Trepang 2 is also worth checking out as well, and I even did a video on it back when it launched in 2023. A sequel to Black was in production for about 3 months, with a very early prototype video surfacing in recent years. However, the project was scrapped due to differences that arose between Criterion and EA. Many of that core team that worked on Black ended up working for Codemasters, who developed Body Count in 2012. If you're curious about checking out Black for yourself or wanting to replay it, it is available on Xbox One as part of their backwards compatibility program. Otherwise, your next best option is to run the game using the latest build of PCSX2, as I had zero issues playing the game outside of a bit of slowdown here and there, which I'm 90% sure is because of the game itself, not the emulator. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed my retrospective piece on Criterion's underrated shooter, Black. Now that I've got a PS2 emulator up and running finally, expect more PS2 related videos, and yes, to all my Castlevania subscribers, this means that I will be covering Castlevania Lament of Innocence and Curse of Darkness sometime in the not too distant future, so stay tuned.